much delay and welcome to the episode of In Conversation with Tibettv. This is Sakina Butt, and today I would like to introduce you to a cultural anthropologist and a historian specializing in contemporary Tibet. She is also an author and a professor in the University of Colorado. She is Dr. Carole McGranahan. Welcome to the show, Carole.
Thank you
very
very
much.
much.
Nice to have you here.
Thank you, Sakina. It's my pleasure.
Okay, Carole, so you have been conducting a research in the Tibetan refugee community in India and Nepal since 1994. So what drew your interest in these areas?
Okay, yeah, right. That's a very good question, right? How did an American, Inji woman like me become interested? When I was a college student, I studied abroad in Nepal, and this was in 1989. I was 20 years old. And my group of college students, all from America, we traveled to a village called Marpa. And Marpa is just south of Mustang and just north of a Tibetan refugee camp. And we lived in this village for several days, learning to speak Nepali. So each day we would learn more Nepali, and many men and women from the Tibetan refugee camp came to talk to us, because we were very unusual to have a group of students from America staying, not just leaving after one day, but staying for several days. And with their English and my growing Nepali, we could talk somewhat, and the stories they told me changed my life. So what they told me was that they had lost their country, that they had left Tibet in 1959 because of the Chinese invasion, and they had followed His Holiness the Dalai Lama out of Tibet. And they told me that for 30 years, they had not been able to return. In 1989, you could not make a phone call, you could not send a letter. There was no mobile phones, there was no internet, there was no WeChat. So they had no way to be in touch with their family. And they didn't know much about what they were doing.
Because you were very young at that time.
I was 20 years old, and I thought it had never occurred to me that you could lose your country, be separated from your family, and not see them for 30 years. So I wanted to know why, what had happened in Tibet. Why did the world not know about this? The more I learned, the more I wanted to help tell the story of Tibet.
So Carole, how much scholarship is available for, on Tibet and the Tibetan people? And why is there always a dread in such scholarships, especially when it comes to academia?
There are many foreign scholars working on Tibet, doing research on Tibet, and of course many Tibetan scholars. But in comparison with, say, scholarship on India or China, the scholarship is quite small. So one reason is that those countries are both so much larger, but also they are intact, They each have their own sovereign state, and Tibet has lost its. And I think in losing its state, Tibet has also lost, in some ways, the sort of global attention, international attention. Usually we think of it only from governments, like international political attention, but it matters also, for scholarly attention. The scholarship on Tibet has really been dominated by scholars of Buddhism, So in terms of religious studies and Buddhist studies, Tibet is very prominent. In terms of anthropology or political science, international relations, or literature, I think we need more attention to Tibet, among scholars.
Tibetans in diaspora are all over the world now. Most of the Tibetans are even seen adopting the culture of the host countries. And even the Tibetans in Tibet, they are being dominated by the Chinese authorities when it comes to religious practices. So where do you see the preservation of Tibetan culture in the long run?
So this is true, Tibetans everywhere in the world, whether they're in Tibet or outside, are adopting other styles and fashions and ideas. And in some ways this has been the case for a long time, So even if we go back in time, Tibetans would adopt traditions or fashions from India or China, even 200 years ago. But right now it's different because of colonization, So Tibet is occupied by China, colonized by China. So it's not a relationship of equality. It's one country under the other. In exile, one thing we've seen is in exile, women, the requirements for women have become much more conservative than they are for men, So I think that's one thing that's been adopted from Indian culture, that women are now required to have a more modest sense than perhaps they did historically in Tibet. In the West, maybe now that restriction is being lifted as Tibetans move to the US, Canada, and Europe, where there are different ideas about women in public domain. I think one thing is that Tibetans have a very strong family system. So whether your family is all here together in Dharamsala, or whether parents are in Tibet, or parents are in America and children are here, there's still strong connection. And I think that strong family connection is one of the most important things that's enabling Tibetan ideas about culture and tradition to be passed to the next generation, while allowing that change is always going to happen. And seeing as though we are here in India right now, and we could say India was colonized by the British, right, for over 200 years, but they did not lose all of their traditions, they didn't lose all of their culture. And once the British were gone, they found ways to bring things back, right, and to even celebrate what they had saved. So I think I have a lot of hope for the ability to save traditions along with bringing new things in as well.
And also, there are many students, Tibetans who live abroad, and now they have very difficulty in speaking in their own language, which is the Tibetan language.
Right.
And they are more convenient in speaking in their English, the language that they speak there.
Right.
So what do you think about this?
I think that language is important. There are many ways to communicate, and there are things that we can say in one language that we can't say in another. So in some ways, language is one of the keys to culture, and it's very important.
So one of your ongoing projects is the study of self-immolation, Tibetan self-immolation.
Yes.
So how do you see this act of protest, and how is it impacting the narration of the Tibetan freedom struggle?
Right, so this first self-immolation is in 1998 in April, right, in Delhi. And then we get the next one in 2009 with Taohe in Tibet. And then starting in 2011, I think actually at the same time that His Holiness was stepping down as a political leader, then all of a sudden many self-immolations start happening. But so as a scholar, I have to ask, what is happening, right? Why are these people doing this? How is the Tibetan community responding? How is Chinese government, how's the world responding? I see the self-immolations, as I understand them, as three things. So first is it's a form of protest to the Chinese government against religious oppression and against political oppression. And we hear this and we can read this in the testimonies that self-immolators leave behind and in the words they say when they are in the burning state. I think second, historically there is no tradition of self-immolation, right, in Tibet. Exactly. But there is a tradition of fire offerings. Right? And every Tibetan home and all monasteries always have a flame burning, right? Yeah. The idea that a flame burning is an offering we can make, right, to the gods. So I see it in that vein that there is also a sense of offering my body as a ray of light, right? So as a religious offering. And then final one is I also believe they're a form of communication. And the communication, as I see it, is to the world, of course. It's to the Chinese government also, but it's to other Tibetans. And so many of the self-immolators, when they speak, when they write, they say, Tibetans be united, Tibetans of the three chokas, come together, put aside your differences. And this is the same message that we heard in the late 1950s, at the time when the Chinese had invaded, Tibetans were organizing. This is part of my earlier research with Chushigangru. Self-immolators are giving the same message to the Tibetan community now.
Tibetan refugees are considered the most successful refugees in the world. So do you agree to that?
Yes and no, right?
Why yes?
So yes, in some ways, here we are in Dharamsala, right? Center of Central Tibetan Administration, exile government with His Holiness here. So Tibetans have their own exile state within the state of India, right? Have your own parliament, government administration, running schools, running legal system, the Mensikang medical system. So much is here. Tibetans vote, Tibetans pay taxes, right? Think of all of the things that you do. So in that sense, the community is incredibly united, coherent, and together working as one. Maybe there are some internal disagreements, but for the most part, it is successful in that sense that the community is truly a singular community, right? Not successful, perhaps, in that the community is still here, right? So in 1959, when His Holiness escaped, everyone thought this would just be temporary, maybe a couple months, then, maybe 1 year, then a couple years. I don't think anyone really thought 60 years later this community would be here. The chance to return to Tibet, to regain Tibet in some political form, that has not yet been successful.
So where do you see yourself 20 years from now?
Myself, retired, I think. Retired. Right. So right now I am writing several books. So I am finishing a book about Pangdatsang family, which was they are a trade family originally from Sawapomda, which is near Chamdo. They moved to Markham, and then family left one son behind in Markham, shifted to Lhasa, and then ended up becoming one of the wealthiest families in all of Tibet by 1950s. And then they had this strong rise in Tibetan society, and then a big fall. Okay. So I'm writing the history of this family as story of contemporary Tibet. The other is actually I'm doing a project on what I call refugee citizenship. Most Tibetans in India and Nepal are not citizens, yet Tibetans, when they move to North America or to Europe, they have to take on citizenship, right? You cannot stay in the United States or Canada, other than as a tourist for a very short time, if you are not a citizen. So the requirements are different in different places, and I'm asking, what are the Tibetan debates about citizenship? How does the citizenship you do or don't have affect the political claims, right, that you can make to Tibet? And looking at different strategies, right, for gaining or not gaining citizenship in different countries.
Okay, Carole, so you have written this book called Arrested History, and it's about Chushikandru.
Yes.
And last Saturday was a very big day, so can you tell us about that a little bit?
Sure. So this past Saturday, which was June 16th, was the 60th anniversary of Chushigandru. So Chushigandru was a citizens' army that first was just ordinary people, both men and women in Kham, rising up to defend their leaders against Chinese People's Liberation Army, eventually joining with other people from other Payu and Kham, joining together to fight, and then eventually the Chinese pushed them all the way to Lhasa, where they joined with men from Amdo, from other parts of Tibet, and formed an official army on June 16th, 1958, devoted to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, to defend the Dalai Lama, to defend the Dharma, and to defend Tibet. So we celebrated the 60th anniversary on Saturday, and this book that I wrote is based on interviews with many of the veterans. So this is both a history of Chushigandru, but also the story of what happened to the veterans and their lives as refugees in India and Nepal.
Lastly, I would like to ask you if you have any few words for the young Tibetans out there, because I believe that you have a very great skill in speaking in Tibetan language. So can you say that? Can you say it in Tibetan?
So to the youngsters, to the young Tibetans, let's say, Sushu love you, Shiwore, Ani Lobjong Yapoche, Ani Carole, Samla Sapa Shigomare, Ani Puge Topse, or Pupe Topse, Gyun Rimpone, Sigire, Yine Rewa Namya Laju Yomare. Don't do it.
Oh, you did very well.
Thank you.
Okay, Carole, thank you so much for speaking to Tibettv, and it's really nice to have you here with us today. Thank you for coming to the show.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. It's nice to be here.
Thank you so much for watching, and see you in our very next episode of In Conversation with Tibettv.